and Dr. Serena Cruz, who will be, as Manju pointed out, will be talking to us from different lens, the legal, the historical, and the personal, political, reproductive rights of women. We look forward to their expertise, and we hope that you will join us at the end of their presentations to ask questions and to also add to this conversation through comments. So I'm going to actually introduce all three speakers right away, and then I will give over the floor, the virtual floor, to Professor Wright. Today's first speaker, Professor Dana C. Wright, is the T. Terrell Sessoms and Gerald Sohn Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Florida, Florida's Levin College of Law. She's also director at the Center of Government Responsibility. Professor Wright has a PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University and a JD from Cornell University's School of Law and New York University School of Law for third year. She has taught various subjects, including constitutional law, trusts and estates, legal history, feminist theory, constitutional law of property, and theories of property. As a legal historian, her research has delved into 19th century English divorce and marriage law, and as well as 19th century American property rights and women's rights and constitutional protections in the 19th and early 20th centuries. She has written extensively on a wide variety of legal subjects, including the Equal Rights Amendment. Professor Wright's work has been published in journals as diverse as Iowa Law Review, the William and Mary Bill of Rights Journal, the Columbia Journal of Gender and Law, Environmental Law, the Wisconsin Law Review, and many others. Her work has been cited by the US Supreme Court and numerous federal and state courts. Welcome, Professor Wright. I will now introduce our second speaker, Dean Rudy Jobard, who is the Associate Dean in Criminal Justice at Broward College. He's also the Professor of History with focus on African American and women's history. Dean Jobard has a master's in Applied Social Science in History from Florida A&M University. Dean Jobard was the Gladys Corporation Endowed Teaching Chair at Broward and has won many accolades and honors, among them the Broward College South Campus Professor of the Year, Charles Lyle Leadership Award, the Legacy Magazine South Florida 40 Under 40 Black Leaders of Today and Tomorrow. Apart from his teaching and administrative responsibilities, Dean Jobard is active in local South Florida community and is a motivational speaker and consultant. Welcome, Dean Jobard, and thank you for joining us. And our third and last but not the least speaker is coming from out of the States, from Holland, and her, Dr. Serena Cruz. She's the founder of SCT Development Solutions International, based in Amsterdam, which provides consulting and training facilitation in areas of healthcare and health systems, gender and gender conflict, ethnography, research and fundraising support for projects targeting hard to reach populations in developed, developing, and underdeveloped contexts. Dr. Cruz has a PhD in international relations from Florida International University. Her specialization is in global health as a medical ethnographer, focusing on complexities of healthcare and varying disease burdens on vulnerable populations. She has consulted and developed many projects internationally, and I'm just naming a few of them. Among her key clients are Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights, Marie Stopes of Uganda, and BRAC, BRACC of Uganda. Thank you all three. Thank you so much for joining us from Netherlands and taking part in this. So we all really are looking forward to what you will share with us. So I give the floor to Professor Wright to take it away. She's going to share with us a PowerPoint. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm gonna go through this very quickly, and I apologize for being sort of a constitutional law nerd, because I just really get off on a lot of this, sort of the technical detail here. But I want you to think about at first that we have this federal system where we have the federal government, that the Constitution gives the federal government certain powers, and the Constitution also tells the federal government you can't do certain things. So at the federal level, the federal Constitution has two roles. It either says you have power to legislate in these areas like interstate commerce or the postal service, and you don't have power in other areas, usually involving individual rights. At the state level, though, states don't have to worry about that, the question of whether they have the power to pass laws. They do. The only restraints on the states are both the federal and their state constitutional provisions that tell them things that they cannot do. So when we think about the Constitution, constitutions are in constitutional law is the regulation of government, and it tells the government what it can and cannot do. But at the state level, states can pretty much do what they want, as long as they don't get into that area of passing laws on things they can't do. So I'm going to come flying through this history of constitutional abortion law as quickly as I can, in the hopes that maybe we have time for question and answer to fill in some of it. So the history of abortion regulations, many of you probably know, abortion was not prohibited in the 19th century. It was around the middle of the 19th century that there was a movement to professionalize obstetrics and gynecology, and to close ranks against the ignorant doctor women, because until then abortion was simply just not regulated. And there's a whole sort of history of how abortion was viewed at the turn of the century, which tended to be it tended to be viewed as a path of last resort, something for fallen women that they needed. It was not seen as a procedure that the average woman, right, especially the respectable married woman, might need. Now, our Constitution, our federal Constitution, has two provisions in there. The Fifth Amendment that says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's the provision that says to the federal government, you cannot pass a law that deprives someone of life, liberty, or property. And then we have the 14th Amendment, which says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. Now, these two due process clauses, one applied against the federal government and one against the states. This is the basis of so much of our federal and state protections of liberty interests. So it comes out of this very broad term, liberty. And what exactly does liberty mean? So starting in around 1890, there's this 46-year period, and this period I think is incredibly important, called the Lochner era. And this was a period when deja vu, a very conservative Supreme Court struck down a whole lot of federal laws that were regulating the marketplace. These were economic laws that regulated business, or attempted to regulate business, contracts, working conditions, wages, minimum wages, maximum hours, those kinds of laws. And the court struck them all down, and they said they did so under the Due Process Clause. They said that these laws, even they were simply just politically against these types of regulations, but they passed them, and they based their rulings striking down the laws on an idea that the liberty prong and the property prong of the Due Process Clause contain these, what we're going to call fundamental rights, this idea that certain rights are more important than other rights. And government cannot interfere with these very important rights. It's almost all entirely economic rights. But there were a couple of cases during this period that focused on family decision-making. So whether to teach a child German, whether to send a child to a private or a public school, were also viewed as really important liberty interests. But the important point about the Lochner era is that you had a very activist court that elevated certain rights to this fundamental rights status. And of course, they did so on the basis of a very conservative political ideology about laissez-faire capitalism, excuse me. And there was a lot of criticism against the court during this period, this Lochner era period. But eventually it was rejected, right? In 1936, with President Roosevelt's threatened court packing plan, the court reversed itself and said, oh, sorry, we were wrong. We didn't mean that. Economic legislation is fine. Government, you can pass all the economic legislation you want. You are not interfering with fundamental economic rights. So they completely backed away. But if you ever read a lot of these due process cases, the court is always saying, we don't want to relive this Lochner era, this period of an activist Supreme Court that was just striking down majority-based legislation left and right because of some political ideological view. So, the irony is very thick here. But this Lochner era is really important because what it did was it gave us the idea that certain rights are fundamental, are more important. For the government to have the power to interfere with those rights, it has to have a really, really good reason to do so. And they're infusing these terms, life, liberty, and property, with the sort of the content of what do we mean by liberty? Well, which liberty interests are really fundamental and which ones are not? And so the court knew that things like speech rights and the right to be free from searches and seizures, which are expressly in the Constitution, that those should be seen as fundamental rights. But other rights, are there any other rights that are not mentioned? And that brings us to 1965, to the Griswold versus Connecticut decision. And this is really the heart of Roe. It was a 6-4, I didn't know, it was a 5-4 decision, 6 different opinions. 4 of them held that, so the rule was Connecticut had criminalized providing contraception, and Connecticut doctors brought a suit to the Supreme Court and said, this Connecticut law violates our liberty interest. And Justice Douglas, for the majority, said, well, if you look at all the different constitutional provisions that are out there, it kind of looks like we could sort of use the term privacy to characterize them all. So if you look at First Amendment speech rights, if you look at the right to be free of search and seizures, you look at the right not to have soldiers quartered in your house, all of those kind of go to this idea of privacy. So we think there is this constitutional zone of privacy that the court, that states and federal government should not interfere with. Okay, so this decision, which generated 2 very strong dissents, it was only a 5-4 decision, really created the idea of privacy. And this is why I say that Roe versus Wade is on very unsteady foundation, because this right to privacy is kind of made up. It really was made up. The word privacy doesn't appear in the Constitution. The word liberty does, but we know liberty could mean the liberty to enter into a contract to work for 20 hours a day, which is what, the court during the Lochner era had said that was what we meant by what is meant by liberty, not so much privacy. So I'm going to go quickly here. Roe versus Wade was passed in 73, was decided in 73, and it was based on this right to privacy. And the important thing I think about Roe is that it set up this 3-trimester structure, which I think was brilliant, right? The first trimester says no regulations by the state are allowed because the risk of an abortion is lower than the risk of carrying a child to term. in the second trimester, regulations are okay. Third trimester, the state can even prohibit. But everybody jumped on the trimester framework rather than, to object to Roe, rather than simply saying, oh, we don't like privacy. We don't like the foundation of the Roe decision in this privacy notion. So then in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the right to an abortion was affirmed, but they did so changing it to a 2-stage rather than a 3-stage framework, pre-viability, post-viability, and they allowed regulation all the way back to the moment of conception in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So we were already seeing chipping away of the reproductive right. It opened the door to more extensive regulation. So since 1965, privacy has become an incredibly important doctrine in our Constitution. So it's protected contraception, interracial marriage, intimate sexual conduct, same-sex marriage, right to refuse or to authorize medical treatment, right to determine how to raise your children. And we've also seen a lot of statutory privacy rights that are ultimately premised on this right to privacy. So your cell phone record, your browser history, financial records, those are all part of this right to privacy. So of course, since then, and I'm going to just zip through these, since then, we've had a lot of endless laws regulating abortion, right? So that's been the approach until now, when the Conservative Party could not get Roe overturned, was to just pass all these ridiculous targeted regulations of abortion provider acts to chip away at the right. In 2007, interestingly enough, the court upheld the first federal abortion restriction. And I want you to think about that, because when we go back to what I said, the federal government has 2 constraints on it: what it can do and what it can't do. But the state government only has what it can't do. The Constitution tells it what it can't do. So the fact that the question of whether we could even have a federal abortion ban is actually, I think, a really live issue, whether the Constitution would permit the Congress to pass a federal abortion ban. Okay, we don't need to worry about that. So then we had Whole Woman's Health that struck down Texas laws that, some Texas trap laws about doctors having admitting privileges, because the court said these were not, they make no sense, right? They don't promote better outcomes, and they are an unreasonable, undue burden on a woman's right to choose. June Medical versus Russo, same law to that one, struck down, or same law as the Texas law. Again, the court struck down these restrictions on abortion providers, although everybody was hoping with Kavanaugh on the court that they would, that the Roe would fall here. It didn't. The dissent in Russo is important because Justice Thomas dissented that women don't have a fundamental right to an abortion, because abortion is based on this illegitimate right to privacy. So Thomas was queuing up exactly what was going to be the argument in Dobbs. So the question for all of us until like a month ago was, what is the court going to do? And I think if you think about it, they really had 3 options. They had the nuclear option, which was to just get rid of privacy altogether, which would have gotten rid of privacy for everything. They could do what I call the surgical drone strike option, which was just to remove abortion out from under that privacy umbrella, which I think is a pretty hard thing to do if you think about it. How do you say the right to an abortion is not a privacy issue, but the right to a vasectomy is? So legitimately, how do you do that? That, of course, is the one that they took. The third option, which is the one that Justice Roberts had advocated for, I call the landmine option, which is to uphold the right in theory, but just continue to chip away at it with lots and lots and lots of restrictions, allow the states to put up all these barriers so that the right is no longer meaningfully exercisable. As we know, the court used that surgical drone strike option. They took abortion out from under privacy. But as we also know, Justice Thomas said, privacy is illegitimate, right? It does not appear in the Constitution, and he would arguably remove all of those constitutional rights from the privacy umbrella. So my last slide here, where do we go from here? So I think there's four sort of possible avenues for our next step. So one is state constitutions. So some state constitutions, including Florida, Florida has an express privacy provision. And the Florida Supreme Court has said that its privacy provision applies to abortions. So abortion is in a very different situation in the state of Florida than it is in perhaps the state of Mississippi. We also have the Equal Rights Amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment has now been ratified by 38 states. It has not been recognized as being in the Constitution yet, but there's a lot of people, including myself, who are out there advocating that, look, the ERA is passed. It's met the technical requirements of Article 5. And if we're going to talk about women's equality, we need to be thinking about, abortion or reproductive rights as part of that. So we have that. We also have state equal rights amendments. Federal law. So if either party could attain a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, which we're a long way from that, we could have abortion legislation at the national level. I think we're going to have some issues with that because there's some real questions whether interstate commerce power, or the power to regulate the post office, gives to the federal government the power to regulate an intimate decision-making, an intimate decision like this. So Gonzalez versus Carhart did not answer that question for us, whether a national abortion ban would work or not. And finally, a constitutional amendment, right? We can always, the people, the states, not that the states will do it, but there's also always the option of a constitutional amendment to either add privacy or add reproductive rights specifically. So I know that took a long time. I hope that gives you a sense of where we are. And I'll shut up, but I'm happy to answer more questions. And I'll stop my screen share.
Thank you. Thank you so much. A lot to think about, and hopefully we can come back and we can have a robust discussion around it. Dean Jean-Bar is going to talk to us next. So I give the mic to you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Let me first again say thank you so much for this opportunity to this daughter. And I'm humbled to be in the midst of Dr. Wright and Dr. Cruz, excellent scholars, right? So I'll just add maybe a little something on the level of those two brilliant minds. I want to begin really with the thought and the comment that adage that is often stated, that parents say to their children at times, do as I say, not as I do, right? And I think that is very applicable to America. When we think about the origin of what became the United States of America, which we first must acknowledge would not have happened without the murder of millions of indigenous people, without the enslavement of African people, right? That there is truly this duality. And there's a sense that when we look at America in its original context, and again, I use the word original loosely because this was occupied land before 1776. And even when we look at the framing of the American government, there is this duality that exists. And historically speaking, people tend to focus on one side or the other, right? And I think you have to focus on both. And what do I mean? There are some who simply exclusively want to focus on the marginalization of this origin, right? The racism, sexism, and all the other isms, classisms, and all the other isms you can think about. And then there are those who don't want to think about those isms at all and just want to trumpet a very glorious origin, if you will, and just speak about virtue. And the reason why it's important to really analyze both is because I think about Dr. King and how he was able to utilize some of the virtuous verbiage that was used, whether it be the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution, to create a framework of revolution, right? And the civil rights movement is a revolution. At the same time, noting that America was a very racist, economically repressive nation, right? And so here you have in America this duality that exists where there is virtue and 13 colonies coming together and saying, you know what, why don't we rebel against England? It is unfair to have taxation without representation. England, of course, taxing the colonies tremendously, in large part because of them trying to recoup from their financial losses in the 7-Year War. Like, that's a virtuous thing, and that's understandable. The idea of essentially that we are to be a nation that acknowledges some semblance of equality, that we are to trumpet life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, even though the pursuit of happiness is something questionable to trumpet, but that's another conversation another day. Those things may seem to be virtuous, and many times they actually are. But what one cannot deny is that those who are the framers of the government were racist, the vast majority of them being slave owners, them being sexist, right? About the fact that for so many women, the need for Seneca Falls in 1848, right? The need for fighting for franchisement, the ability to vote, and that not coming to pass until 1920 speaks to this racism and sexism that exists in America. Why do I bring these things up? I bring them up because when we look at things like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it is rooted in a marginalization that has existed throughout the entire time in America, right? And so that is the first thing, that the reason why we are offended, many, is because it seems as though it opposes the virtues of liberty, democracy, which we claim for America to be. But again, we have to be honest that America is the embodiment of do as I say, not as I do, right? And at times, I can construct new words in order to match what it is I am doing, right? And so there is this schizophrenic reality where the marginalized are saying, well, you said this, so let's acknowledge this, right? And those things can actually be altered if certain people are in positions of power, right? That's the first thing. The second thing I want us to think about is, well, what has led us to this point, right? And one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that it is not an accident that the majority of the justices of the Supreme Court have what are deemed a conservative viewpoint and a conservative mindset. And that at times that can be tempered unless society seems to really be pushing against what has been deemed as traditional values, right? An example that comes to mind is Barry Goldwater in 1964. He runs against Lyndon B. Johnson, very conservative. He is sounding the alarm. He's suggesting that America is losing its way. And it's not a coincidence that at that moment in time, you have the civil rights movement, you have a plethora of movements that are going on at that moment in time. Women are becoming more empowered. And so here is someone who is extolling, right, these, at that time, ultra-conservative viewpoints and creating hysteria with the thought that America is losing its way. But what happens? He gets trounced by Lyndon B. Johnson. Many people just kind of consider him as some nut, not what he was doing was really beginning what will become a movement that would enter into the mainstream. Now what we find in 2016 is someone who is extolling same ultra-conservative viewpoints. Now, whether or not he's truly ultra-conservative or whether more so self-serving, that's for debate. But nonetheless, we cannot just argue or debate that Donald Trump was positing very conservative viewpoints, but he doesn't get trounced. He actually wins. Granted, he does not win the popular vote, as we know, but he does win the election, right? And so the question becomes, why is that? How is it that Barry Goldwater in 64 gets trounced And then in 2016, where it seems as though we are evolving at a greater clip as a nation, he actually wins, right? I think that speaks to the legitimate fear, and legitimate, again, that could be debatable, but I'm not, from my perspective, but from those who are positing that mindset, right? That there's this hysteria and this fear, and what symbolizes fear in part is the election of Barack Obama, right? It is one thing to say, let us experience integration, which I posit has some power, but minimal power, nothing compared to a biracial man actually being the president of the United States. That is a different level of power, that different level of hysteria, right? And so one of the things I think about is Kimberly Crenshaw uses this term intersectionality, right? Which really kind of looks at the Black woman experience, being that she is both Black and woman, marginalized racially, marginalized when it comes to. But I want to also expand that, if I may, to say that there is this intersectionality constantly throughout American history where race and gender politics are very much intertwined, right? I think that this is a moment of that. I don't know if there isn't an election of Barack Obama where there is this racial hysteria, that there also is going to be a general hysteria that is going to posit ultra-conservative viewpoints that can manifest themselves into the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Lastly, because I know my time is coming to an end, one of the things I want us to think critically about that there will be at one point in time an overturning of the overturning, right? And where is there precedence of this? The Brown v. Board decision was really a refutation of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is necessary in order for us to get to that place as a country for there to be an overturning of the overturning, right? Some of that could be a thought of the composition of our current Congress, as well as the element, of course, of the executive branch continuously. And then also, we have to really start taking a look at the way in which are brought forth, right? Which is the nomination of a president and, of course, the approval thereof of members of Congress. Is that essentially the most effective aspect of it? And so we know that without the election of Donald Trump, there's a large chance not in this particular position. And so there is definitely a large political influence that is really impacting the justices in a way that is truly uncomfortable, because then it becomes really difficult to have legitimate checks and balances, right? We know that the framers of the government for there to be checks and balances. But what happens when the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch are single-minded and in concert to project ideals that the majority of the nation don't have? That can lead to dangerous outcomes. We've seen it has come to this in the case of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, as well as potential outcomes in the future. And so that is where I'll end my introductory comments.
Thank you, Dean Chopin. You've given us a lot to think about, particularly pulling us back to the formation of this nation and the dual ways in which we must engage with the past, with the glorious aspects of it, but also the ugly, the racist and the sexist aspects of its formation, and how it leads us to this point. So there's so much to think about. Thank you so much. And thank you for keeping time as well. Our last speaker is Dr. Serena Cruz, who I think, she had to, I think she's here. Yes, she is. So I will give the mic over to you, Dr. Cruz, to share with us your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumita. I want to also say thank you, Manju, and this daughter, for inviting me. I was a bit surprised. And I think the connection, of course, came through Mona Lisa, who's a wonderful person in my life. But I was struck by the invitation in the sense that I didn't really know what to talk about. I left the United States about 14 years ago. Since then, I've lived in several other countries. The Netherlands is the only other high-income country that I've lived in. And I wondered what can I bring to this discussion other than I happen to still hold an American passport. And Mona Lisa was very supportive and I think generous in suggesting that perhaps my contribution could be to provide some sort of a comparison in the sense of the work that I do abroad. So I'm going to try to do that. But it's going to be very in the moment because one thing I've learned about these conversations is that they really are a moment. And I've had many of them because my work has taken me to places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I've worked on trying to get at the root causes of sexual violence in conflict. It's taken me to Uganda, where I've looked at commercial sex work and the social networks that sustain sex work communities, HIV. More recently, I'm working in global surgery. And so I'm looking at what is it that keeps people outside of the healthcare system. So this week, I actually attended this beautiful event held at Utrecht University. And it was a global surgery and OBGYN week-long event. So before going into this, I had really never heard of global surgery. I cut my teeth on, this sounds terrible to say, but really conflict, issues of gender and conflict, and infectious disease and gender. And so when I moved into global surgery, there was this really interesting preoccupation with facts that are unquestionable. It's very different than the law, I would say, because the law is designed to be questioned, right? And to sort of look at how do we work through it. But in medicine, it's just established, right? Like if you do this if you pump this 3 times this way, this will be the most likely outcome, right? Or if you cut here, this will cause that to happen. So medicine has this very sort of assumed truth, in fact. So when I moved into that field just now 2 years ago, at first I felt really comforted by it, right? Because working in violence is tough. How do you solve the root causes of sexual violence and conflict? I'll just want to let you all know I didn't manage to accomplish that task when I was working in the Congo Kinshasa for 3 years. And I didn't manage to resolve HIV programming for women in the sex trade who clearly know how to use condoms just fine. And that's not the issue. It's more about, social dependence and whatnot. But so now I'm in medicine. I'm quite comfortable and comforted by this fact. And one of the things that I starts to niggle at the back of my mind is that there are certain medical conditions that just sort of fall off the table, literally. And one of them, obviously, is abortion, right? Or what we'd say fetal termination. We'd call it induced miscarriage. There's lots of terms for this, but in a very clear way, it sort of falls outside of medicine. It almost belongs, and I would say what my view of Roe v. Wade is that it has become entirely outside of medicine in the United States, right? It is a medical procedure. Similarly, though, because I work outside of the US and live outside the US, so are other medical conditions. And what seems to be the one thing they have in common is that they involve a uterus. And half of the world's human population has a uterus. So that's kind of a conundrum. But I'll give you some examples of these other conditions so that it sort of touches upon this last thing I want to get at eventually, which is exceptionalism. Abortion is not an exceptional, we don't care condition or procedure. Others are postpartum hemorrhage. In fact, that is the greatest killer for women that, for different reasons, have to carry to term and birth. We also have eclampsia and preeclampsia. And for obstructed birth, there is, a real need for cesarean, emergency C-section, essentially, is pretty much not available. So like 88% of the world's women that are carrying, fetuses, babies, whatever the word is we're going to use here, are really in danger of going in to give birth and just not making it to the next day. That's a real threat. So to come back to this notion of what is exceptional, I guess for lots of reasons as well, the United States is in this, it's in the timeline of the globe, right, of nation states, of cultures, of societies. And it thrives in many ways on being unique, right? It has this unique history. It has this exceptional moment. And the things it does are different. They're special, right? And even Roe v. Wade being overturned, my goodness, that is unique. And yet it's not, right? If we look at Malawi, for example, where I've lived and worked for some time in HIV, doing HIV work, they had this very fractious post-colonial electoral process. They were liberated from the British. They established a political party. Their first president was this amazingly educated, British educated Malawian who really wanted to bring something of new and healing to Malawi, right? And it just didn't happen. So what Malawi experienced was, like 30 plus, 40 plus years of a single party, in reality, a single party dictatorship with real consequences. And then he was ousted passively, not violently, right? Passively ousted through an electoral process, and change in 2000 came in. And there was a bit of a sliding back, 2 presidents later, and then they rebounded again. So, there are examples. This is just the one that comes to mind because I lived and worked there for a year, and it was very fresh. I was there during 2 elections. And you could see that human beings, despite their access to things or the limits to that access, can manage to govern, can self-govern, and they can make changes that upend something that might seem very logical in one instance or to one group and illogical to another. So we have that. And so I think with the issue of abortion, to me, why I thought it would be also helpful to talk today is because I'm most interested in taking it back from a social discussion, right? Like I don't need to advocate for the right to have a wart removed. I don't need to advocate for the right to have vaginoplasty, do I? Although that is happening. I don't have to advocate for the right to have breast implants. Let's say I might need to advocate for the implants to be safe and not kill me, but I don't need to advocate for these changes. But vaginoplasty and other cosmetic surgeries are available because they really keep in place what I think as a feminist is the sort of fundamental issue. And that is a heterosexual gaze, right? It's a gaze that is embedded in everything. And that gaze it persists and it's everywhere. So, and it's even inside male gay spaces in terms of the way gay men objectify one another and sexualize one another. It's just on a different subject that they're doing it to now, right? It's another man. And I would even go so far that it's probably there although I haven't seen it so overtly, but even in same-sex relationships with women, there is a particular way of coming at the object of your desire, of what you consider erotic, with this male gaze, this masculine way of being. And so I think it would be really important to talk about these medical conditions and think through what is permissible and what isn't, and why isn't it permissible, just medically, right? Like, I think Professor Wright, your presentation is spot on in giving us tools to understand our history. And our dean is able to give us a reminder of what is basically sand under the feet, right? Because if it's a history that's established on something that's constantly shifting, then where do you go? But none of that is exceptional, right? Like that, we have these practices of legal formation and histories that are fraught with just horrific things in lots of places, basically wherever there are humans. But what I do think we also have is this ability to say, again, just to reiterate, there are certain medical conditions. If we just accept the fact that medicine is guided by a preference for truth and fact, then why are there certain practices that are just taken out of that? And why are those practices disproportionately, if not all, practices or conditions or treatment plans that affect 1/2 of our species? And how do we get them back under that truth or that objective or that way of treatment? Or do we need to? Or maybe that's another route, is like, say, if you're politicizing these conditions and you're politicizing this treatment, then shall we open up medicine for more deconstruction? I don't know. But I will say that this is something that's really interesting to me. I'm teaching next week. I'm going to be teaching at the University of Amsterdam. I teach every summer. I give a course, and this year I titled it Critical Global Surgery. For my Dutch colleagues, they often don't know what I mean by critical, because that's not how. So I usually have to say critical thinking, but it's really to sort of get at. I'm just curious. This is something that is really getting to me. I want us to take a look at. And within global surgery, I have about 5 more minutes, so I'm just going to gobble it up. But within global surgery, we have, it's predicated on this huge movement that happened in, this is how the history goes, just so you know. This isn't actually what happened, but this is how the history is shared. There was this massive movement that formed in 2015, and there was a swell of, basically American plastic surgeons and a few others who showed up at the World Health Assembly and said, there are these conditions and they need to be treated. These are essential. And when I remember when I got into it, I said, okay, well, I'd like to see this essential surgical list. And it's like, it's about 15. They haven't really decided, but it's 15 to 17. They shifts depends on who's presenting the facts, but it's about 15 procedures. And they're really important. I mean, I know that if I had these conditions, I would like cleft lip and club foot and, and inguinal hernia, cataracts. I mean, these are, I know that I would want treatment. But just as a last sort of story to share, when I was in the Department of Plastic Surgery with my surgeons, that's what I call them, I was just like, the University of Amsterdam, the AUMC, which is this it's the 2 faculties or colleges of medicine that merge. The Free University, the Vrij, the VU-MC, is the Netherlands' premier academic hospital and one of the world's epicenters for gender surgery. Okay, so I was talking to the head of the department. I said to Mark Brahm, why isn't gender reassignment surgery on the essential list? I'm like, why aren't we doing trainings in that? And he was like, it's just because, it's just really not essential. And I was like, well, I mean, if I thought that I was going to be murdered because I have reassigned, myself, or I look in the mirror every day and I want to commit suicide and I'm on all these antidepressants and I'm talking to people left and right because I don't match who I am, I kind of think it's essential. Thanks, Sumita. And this was a conversation we had 2 years ago, and I'm still stuck with this. I'm like, who gets to decide what's essential? That's really what's happening to me when I look at Roe v. Wade. There's just a group that gets to decide what's essential. And that group also gets to decide, which subsidies happen and, these other areas of exploitation, right? So what I decided to do with my course this year is like what we say in global surgery. There's four things we advocate for: access to surgery, obstetrics, trauma, and anesthetic care worldwide. So next week's course is going to be, we're going to be surgery, obstetrics, trauma, and anesthetic care. And for surgery, we're going to look at, hernia repair surgery for men and gender surgery. And we're going to just talk about their essential, like what makes this one essential and what's not. And we're going to look at the case of South Africa. In my last 2 minutes, I'll say South Africa is one of the only countries in the world that provides public funding for gender surgery. And the list for these surgeries is like 30 years long because there's only one surgeon in the whole country that knows how to do bottom and top. And he only does surgery 1 day a year in the public hospital. And the rest is done in his private clinic. So there are surgeons in the public system with the capacity and likely residents that could learn this and would appreciate a training program. But where the training is, where the skill set is, there isn't an incentive, So I'll leave you all with this, just me talking about life and stuff and my work. But it really comes down to who decides what's essential. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cruz. Again, so many questions you have raised here, which are, I think, fundamental. And one that I really want to focus on is the point where you said, you really want to take. And I think that's a really, really important angle that we must look at, and to take abortion out of the social political discourse and put it back in health and medicine, because as you pointed out rightly, it is to most women, it is a very essential right that one should have access, not that everyone's running to get an abortion, but that it has all, it's a question of health, it's a question of choice, it's a question of to put back to what Professor Wright said, liberty in the most fundamental sense of how we live our lives, because that can really impact from whether we are able to pursue what we want to do in our lives, our jobs, our, and even our ability to live or to die if we don't have access to it, right? So I think that's so very important. And you've raised some really fundamental questions from the health angle. And the second thing that I really appreciate is what you said about that, we tend to see United States, and particularly sitting in the United States, as a silo of exceptionalism. And that that point you made, that Roe v. Wade, we see as, whoa, this is so terrible, and this has only happened in the United States. But getting that international perspective allows us to see that, in fact, these are struggles of women across the globe, and there may be pathways to create international solidarities, medical solidarities, to put this on an essential list, so thank you so much for your insight. And at this point, I would like to open it up to the audience to engage with our speakers, to ask questions, or any comments that you have, please do so. And I would like my thisdaughter.com's board members to help me navigate this, because I am, let's see if I can see everyone. Yeah, I think I can see everyone. So what you could do is just raise your hand, or if your video is not on, then you can do the reactions, like there's a raise hand under the reactions button, and I will come to you. Please unmute yourself if you want to talk, and please keep your questions and comments brief so that the speakers can respond. Thank you so much. Valerie, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question regarding how we move forward from here in terms of creating some energy and enthusiasm in the population in addressing this issue. I was part of the 60s movement, and remember when Roe versus Wade occurred, and it was after a pretty big fight. And I observe now, for the young people that I see, and even the older people, there seems to be a laissez-faire attitude here. I mean, there are people who go to rallies, but in general, and maybe it's COVID related, I get this feeling of, well, oh yeah, just another thing. And I don't know if other people are feeling that, but if that's the case, I'm looking for some insight as to how we can move forward with involvement, you know, getting some concrete action plan and then getting people involved. So anybody could address that.
Thank you, Valerie. Any of the speakers feel free to please, respond, or anybody who's participating in this conversation can also jump in.
Well, I'll just say one thing, which is, I think that I still look back on Prohibition as a really good example of a situation where you had a movement that was 50 years. Again, it was close to 50 years, the temperance movement, and it had really built up quite a political base. Politicians were defined based on whether they were wet or dry. And very, very quickly, as soon as national prohibition happened, that people said this is a bad idea, and they tried to numerous ways to get rid of it. They challenged the amendment in court. They tried to pass legislation. They made arguments that, well, the states weren't really bound by this. I mean, they tried everything, and then finally it was like, well, the court resisted every effort, and so it took another constitutional amendment. And I think that we're reaching a place legally right now where we had built the entire sort of modern liberal state on a constitution that was written in 1787 that really doesn't have what we need in it. And because of that, everything's vulnerable. So I all of the rights that we've now come to expect. So I'm hoping that we will see a galvanizing of interest in the political, in politics, right? And sort of, and I go to Dr. Cruz's point, which I think was exactly right on, is why are certain medical decisions politicized? Right?
Yes.
When should the legislature be making a medical decision? When should the legislature be telling you, a woman, when an abortion, at this week versus that week, an abortion is permissible or not permissible? They are not doctors, right?
Yes.
They're absolutely not doctors. And yet, obviously, issues around reproduction and women's reproduction have been politicized for a very, very long time. Women's sexuality, women's reproduction. So I don't know. I mean, I have high hopes that there will be more public outcry, and that that the electorate will get out and do something. But I think it's going to be a 20-year process legally to get some, because that's, it was 12, 13 years on prohibition. And I think it's going to be longer in our case.
Dean Jabbar, do you want to say something, or Dr.
Yeah,
Cruz?
I saw Dr. Cruz raise her hands. Like,
Oh, sorry.
But no, that's fine.
Dean, please go ahead. I can go last.
I'm sorry.
I'll say this. The point that you bring up, Valerie, is the question you bring up is a good one. Steve Frazier wrote a book called The Age of Acquiescence, the life and death of the American resistance to organize wealth and power. And that pretty much is articulating what you were referencing, right? So throughout America's history, for a certain period of time, there always seemed to be a certain level of resistance, right? And it doesn't seem to be the same level as before. That being said, I would say that we have to be mindful that resistance is still going on. There are a lot of young people who are resisting. There are a lot of people who are truly in the streets, as well as critically engaged in a resistance effort. I think that they may not be trumpeted as much, but they do exist. That being said, there is some nuance as to the way in which power is being executed is at a different level, right? And what I mean by that is there was a sense of I can resist and there might be some semblance of protection. The danger of when all the branches of government seem to be working together to house power, it becomes a question of where is the protection? So if I am saying, all right, I know that the courts will protect, but now the courts are part of the marginalization and the execution of power. If the thought is, well, maybe the president will make a difference. But if that seems to be minimal, well, we have to be mindful that there are a lot of young people who voted in 2020 with the hope that there was going to be wholesale changes. And whether we would agree with them or not, many of them feel as though that was not the case, and therefore it was really exercise of. The other piece to consider is different now in comparison to, let's say, the 60s, which people often trumpet as the greatest generation ever, is we are very much in a very consumer-driven nation. And so we are consumed by other aspects where we are literally on Twitter, as an example, and I'm guilty of this, right? Where I'm scrolling and I'm engaged in movement stuff and a variety of things, but then the next tweet deals with the Miami Hurricanes, and I love the Miami Hurricanes. It's like, oh, I hate what we're going through, but it's like, oh, we got a new recruit. Like, that duality is real, right? And so one of the things that we have to really get to understand is that when it comes to young people in particular, we have to be able to firmly establish the why. Why should you care? And what we tend to do is to simply think, oh, understand. No. Why should you care? And then also be mindful of building out future generations, and that the answer is not going to be solved in the here and now. Those individuals who are executing the power eventually will die. That's a reality. Unfortunately, many of the young people get older and become the same kind of people. So we really have to think, how do we genuinely shift the generations so that way they don't become the same kind of people? And that really is empowering young people with tools, with the why, and more knowledge and less judgment. That's definitely critical.
Yes, thank you. So, Dr. Cruz, please go ahead.
I'm really enjoying this this dialogue because it's also so American, and I haven't been around so many Americans in a while. So this is really interesting to me. So Valerie, I want to say that this could be, your question is a question that I mostly hear from people in the United States. It's not a question that I usually hear outside. So what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is just give you a little bit of international context to see, so that you have a point of reference when you say, like, what can be done. So two things. A lot is happening because the vast majority of the world's women live without the right to abortion. So your question is unique in that it's asking something that for a brief period of time was a privilege for one nation out of very many that do not have that. So that is really important to keep that context in place, because what we like to say in health is, content is key and context is God, right? So, so if we take your experience, Valerie, in the 60s, where you were advocating for something and you saw that change, that was a very rewarding moment. But it was I would say it was very at the front of what is happening globally. So right now, globally, there are so many efforts to tackle the lack of like a well woman's care, basically, for the world's women. The language, though, is different, because what was going on in the 60s, to Professor Wright's point about, what is in time, what is out of time, and also the dean's point about, like, we have to think about what is the lexicon of today. So the language of the United States at that period of time was unique in that it was pushing for things that people didn't talk about publicly. And one of those was their uteruses. So that is where the United States gave a gift to other movements around the world, because now it made it okay to talk about things that we're just not allowed to be talking about. We're still outside the United States. We're still in that place where we're just trying to name bits, body bits. We're still trying to name what happens to those body bits. But because, Valerie, your history, because you're at the front, it's like you're still in the front here, and people are trying to catch up. And the way that they're catching up is through medicine and through well women, like a well women's approach or safe motherhood. So yesterday I attended this beautiful, we're doing this implementation on a global scale. We're working across our planet to try to identify partners that could help implement standards and guidelines around these exact things. And the project that I was listening to is a collaboration between Columbia University and a hospital in the Dominican Republic. And I was listening to them talking about what they're doing for neonatal resuscitation, like baby comes out, and most places that lack resources slap the baby on the bottom or the feet until it cries. Efficient, but probably not. Evidence shows it's not the best approach. But so what they're trying to do is teach resuscitation, and at the same time, they're trying to respond faster and faster to postpartum hemorrhage. Okay. What is a contributing factor to postpartum hemorrhage is self-termination, right? Like the sense that and also gynecologists and obstetricians learn, actually medical students learn how to treat a miscarriage, right? They don't learn how to perform an abortion. So a miscarriage from a medical technical perspective as a treatment option, it's to perform a miscarriage. So it's the same. So what I'm trying to tell you, Valerie, is that the world is catching up, and they're catching up in a different way than maybe what you recognized when you were at the front. Mm-hmm. And so it's so important to look at your history. It's like, I'm going to do a terrible comparison just because I'm basically a Luddite when it comes to technology, but it's like if somebody from the future came back in time and was like, why are you using those things that you pick up and you turn the dial, and everybody's got like smartphones on, right? So there's this pace at which the United States was able to be at, which we've slowed down because our economy has slowed and our economy's become less equal. But in the 60s, when we had those financial reserves and people could go to school and public education was free, there was a lot of innovation, and that included how we talked about bits. So I just want to give you a reassurance, but couch it in an informative way so you get the sense that okay, it's not just abortion. It's literally what are we doing for women's well-care, and who's doing it and where? And now it's our turn. I mean, I am still an American. It's inside the United States. It's your turn. It's our turn to collectively sort of look around and see how our language can start to match what's happening globally.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes, I do think that one has to have not just a national perspective on what is happening within the borders and boundaries of our nation, but in terms of not just abortion rights, but larger rights, women's rights in a larger sense. But and I wanted to ask a question kind of related to that is, what do you feel is, should we view this decision that has come to us on June 24th to overturn Roe v. Wade as this kind of narrowly women's issue of women's rights and women's reproductive rights, or should we look at this decision as setting a kind of precedent? I would even argue dangerous precedent for broader repercussions of other rights. How do you guys see this decision in that sense, its impact on other rights? I think Professor Wright, you mentioned part of it in your presentation, but if we could discuss that, because I do feel in our response to address this, and I agree with all of you that it's not going to happen in the moment. It will take history. The change in history happens over a long period of time, unfortunately, and so it's not going to be immediate. But perhaps we need to look at what kind of precedent this decision has set for other rights, and therefore then we can imagine or try to think of solutions, both domestically but internationally as well, as something where it's becoming extreme conservatism, extreme activism that is taking away rights, which is unusual and new for us, where rights are being taken away rather than being granted. So if you all could talk to that perhaps a little bit.
And Sumita, I want to take this one step further and say that what is also happened, what happened with what I looked at when the Roe v. Wade, when the overturn happened, it's about redefining abortion. It's redefining it in terms of taking it away from medicine and making it much more about a moral compass. It is about sin. It's about religion. It became more centered in the honor of motherhood, in the honor of the nation, in keeping the demographics going, keeping the economy moving forward. So the minute you sort of wrap medicine into this morass of morality, that it makes it easier to sell it to a certain population,
right?
Make it more acceptable in terms of this is all right at the cost of health, of women, of girls. And I think that's what we need to sort of also push back on. It's not just about the law, it's about this reincarnation that is happening of a medical.
And collapsing of church and state happening in some ways, where a particular vision of religious ideology is seeping into exactly the point you're making, so that it sells kind of this moral discourse. And to the point Dr. Cruz said, she wants to take it out of this moral, social, political discourse to medicine, and it's moving away from there. And how do we bring it back? So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
If I can say something to touch upon, maybe Professor Wright can address this. We've seen Roe v. Wade through the lens of privacy, but what about religious freedom? Because certain religions may not think that a fetus is a person, right? So you're infringing on their religious freedom.
Yeah, many interesting points. I would say on the religious freedom question, I mean, we all have to be pragmatic here. We know that the only religion that matters before the court right now and to politicians is sort of a Christian nationalist view. So I don't see, as much as I would love for everybody to be principled and not hypocritical, I don't think that's going to happen, right? So that they're fine saying that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception. That's a religious view and we have to protect it. But any other religious view that doesn't agree with that, we're not going to protect. But I guess I want to come to this issue in particular about the idea of taking away rights. I think that the 70s and the 80s, even starting really with Brown versus Board of Education, that was the exceptional period in our history, that until that point, the court had been very sort of hands-off. They had allowed a lot of morals legislation. And it really was this sort of moment of individual rights that the court protected, and they came up with their method of protecting it through privacy. I think that was the exceptional moment. And I'm not at all surprised that we're moving away from that. It has bothered a lot of people philosophically that they can't tell the rest of the world what to do, right? It's like, do as I say, not as I do. It's a perfect example of that, right? It's that the politicians whose wives and daughters are having abortions want to tell everybody else that they can't have abortions. So that's part of it. I guess, I don't know, I'm sort of an eternal optimist. I do feel like we're going to go through a dark period, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel, in that there are certain things that people just are going to demand. And we are not going to see, privacy completely thrown out the window. Or if we are, if the court, like Justice Thomas is willing to toss privacy altogether, that's because he wants a constitutional amendment for privacy. Although I think he would like it to exclude abortion somehow. So I'm not exactly sure he really is in favor of it. But the idea is we could be much more explicit and intentional in trying to protect these really important fundamental rights. I think this conversation we're having right now wouldn't happen 10 years ago, because abortion, we just knew was a right. It was a fundamental right. And we don't have to talk about the fact that we've politicized this one medical procedure and not others, and that all the procedures involving women's reproduction have been politicized. We can now have that conversation, and hopefully we can move forward to draft better legislation, better constitution, better methods of supporting it. It's going to be a dark period in the meantime, but I actually think that the population is not going to accept this. So that I don't know, maybe I'm making lemonade as well.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. One of the things that I'm thinking about, and shout out to Dr. Cruz for putting scholarly article in the chat. One of the things I think about is made mention of the word essential, right? And what comes with that for me is what people determine as urgent differs, right? And so Dr. Wright makes a really great point. Now I'm thinking about it as far as, yes, that was an exceptional time. It does beg the question though of this regression that we're experiencing. How far will the regression go? And will it be at the detriment to our democracy as we know it, which can then lead to some really dire consequences? And there always seems to be a sense of we need to experience extreme measures in order to cultivate extreme pushback. And at what point in time will that no longer be effective, right? And so the religious piece that you bring up, Manju, is something that has always been the case. The problem is, again, how it is being utilized and within whose hands is it being utilized, and how it really is a political stratagem, right? And so let me read something, a short quote from John Adams, where he says, if an election is to be determined by a majority of a single vote, and that can be produced by a party through artifice or corruption, the government may be the choice of a party for its own ends, not for the national good, right? And so we saw a shift where the Republican Party saw that these Southern Democrats were displeased of the racial progress that America seemed to be experiencing. All right, so now pluck them from the Democratic Party. And then you have evangelical wave and rise, right? The 70s and 80s in particular, where that becomes a group that you can pluck, and then that becomes a base, if you will. Matter of whether or not I truly believe this, it's a matter of whether or not you're going to vote so that I can have power. The danger, I don't think the John Adams of the world, who was extremely classist, right, and did not think that everyone should have the right to vote, did not envision is that some of these people that during their time period would be deemed as intellectually inferior, not worthy of the ability to vote. Not only are they voting, but they are now occupying office, right? And I don't think a lot of people foresaw that. I don't think a lot of people foresaw the Marjorie Greens of the world literally being in office, right? And that's what has occurred in 2016, is that it allowed for there to be groups of people who not only are a part of this religious zeal that is very dangerous and is against what the framers anticipated, which is the thought that there should be a clear delineation between church and state, right? Those should be separated. But now those individuals are occupying office. Thing for a pastor to rile up his or her congregation to go vote. It's another thing for him or her to be a senator and having his or her ideology take center stage and cultivate laws that are very harmful to women, right? And so, because you have these individuals who are extremely religious, for them, this is essential. The danger in that is it's literally killing people whose rights are therefore being destroyed. And for them, this is essential, right? And so it does beg the question of how far are we going to as a nation, and at what level of detriment will we experience before there's a turn for the better? And if not, that's a very scary prospect.
Just thank you, Dean, and thank you, Professor. Two thoughts came to my head when I was listening to the questions, as well as these really inspiring responses. The first, with regards to Professor Wright, is the question that I was hoping, I hope you will answer, Professor, is what is in the interest of business with regards to the dilution of privacy? So I kind of want to hold space for, you know, the United States prides itself on being very industrious. So I wonder, there isn't any evidence that demonstrates that when a state, a nation state, when a state retracts its support for women's health, that it does necessarily well. It's not necessarily a very competitive state when it comes to business, right? So there's no evidence that supports that. The second thing I had when our dean was speaking was, I thought about this idea of, this is really to Manoj's question about religion. I was thinking about this important difference between the notion of progress and the notion of time. The United States is great as a culture. We entwine them, time and progress. They're not inherently conceived that way. So I'm actually, like the professor, I'm pretty optimistic. You know, the longer I'm outside of my country of origin, the more that I see the way time and progress unfold around the world, the more optimistic I am about the fact that it's becoming, despite how clumsily and imperfectly and at times violently and deadly it is, our species, I think, over time is elevating. And elevating in the sense that we're becoming more conscious in terms of how we govern. And we're seeing that consciousness in terms of international agreements. So there's a lot of international normative language that comes around rights. It doesn't mean that those have that they're obligatory, right? Because that's a different framework that the professor could probably speak to. But we are seeing a language that is more oriented towards unity than ever before. And it's not perfect. And I think this might be the thing that keeps tripping folks inside the US. So much of what is sold, I remember when living there, and I haven't been to the States in 4 years, so it's hard for me to remember, but I know when I lived there, the idea was perfection. Even if it wasn't stated, it was to be lived, it was to be embodied. And perfection comes with this, it's a story, right? It's a story, like if it's perfect, then I'll feel safe. If it's perfect, then I'll be comfortable. If it's perfect, I will be full. If it's perfect, I will be relieved. And yet you can never achieve that. And that's the same thing with this notion of like, well, our time has to encompass progress, and that progress has to lead us to, I'm gonna be fine, I'm gonna be safe. What's happening is, and how I see it is, all the skeletons are just jumping out of the closet in that country, right? And when I think about what is permissible to talk about in a country like the Netherlands, which I will give you a bit of a reference in just a moment, and what we actually get away with in terms of talking about in the States, it is so admirable, and I get so excited to be American. So here's two examples. In the Netherlands, you have nationally, it's centralized government, so you have a 5-day waiting period with a mandatory ultrasound. And you cannot terminate after 14 weeks unless there's a medical indication, and then you can't go past 24 weeks. The end. The Netherlands, where we tolerate prostitution, and drugs. The other thing I want to say is that there's this cultural practice here called Black Peat, Zwarte Piet. I don't know if you know about this. First time I ever saw it, I almost fell on my face. It was so offensive. So Saint Nicholas, the story of this individual called Saint Nicholas, rode through from Turkey and came up through Spain, according to the Dutch version of it. And at the time that he arrived in Spain, he had to civilize the Moors. And the Moors are North Africans, African in the sense of Black, that had overtaken Iberia, and they were uncivilized and they were Muslim. And so Saint Nicholas civilized them, and he captured these Moors and gave them the ring of slavery and put them to work as his helpers, and would ride a ship from Spain, because the Netherlands had been a territory of Spain, and it was called the Spanish Netherlands, and would ride a boat, not a bike. He might actually ride a bike eventually, but he rode a boat up to the Netherlands, gets out every year on his white pony with his bishop's instrument or device and his bishop gown and his black peats. And they go through the Netherlands and they bring sweets. And if you're naughty, these Black Moors will put you in a bag and take you back to Spain to do what, who knows. And the children grow up with this story, and the adults that play the parts of Saint Nicholas or Sint and the Black Peats, it's usually a Caucasian, Saint Pete or Saint Nicholas, sorry, a Caucasian, very clearly a blue-eyed individual, very fair, with a long white beard and a big bishop. And a Pete is always a white person, but they do blackface. Put on really lots of black face paint. They make their lips really big. They go out and buy very tight curled wigs, and they act really silly and dumb and simple. And this is celebrated every year here, every year. So it is important to contextualize.
Dr. Cruz, we'll have to wrap up. I'm sorry to interrupt.
To contextualize this, because our progress and our time do not inherently need to be together.
Yes. True indeed. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to have interrupted you, but we've gone 5 minutes past, and I know that all 3 speakers have raised such fundamentally important questions for us to think about moving forward. And I absolutely, we could have continued for another hour, I think, given the enormity of what we face today. But I think we've also, all of you have also given us some clear pathways to not lose hope, and to actually find ways to be, both in the legal, the political, the civic, and our own personal sphere, find ways to engage and move this forward to a more, as Dr. Cruz just wrapped up, to a space of progressing towards a greater rights-based international order, right? And United States has to be part of that. And I feel that it might take us a little while, but I think we have the tools to do that. And we have the history to back us, that we have done it in the past, and we can do so moving forward. So thank you, all of you, and particularly our speakers, Professor Wright, Dr. Cruz, and Dean Jean-Part, for sharing your thoughts with us and allowing us to think through this new problem that we face today, which we can, of course, will change in time. And Manju, would you like to say something on behalf of thisdaughter.com?
Yes, not to cut you off, but is there anyone else who might want to say, has a question for any of those speakers? If not, thank you again for giving us your time on a Saturday morning, and Serena, Saturday afternoon. I know you have so much going on, so thank you so much for joining us. I would like to say that hopefully we'll be having another event, hopefully not virtual, on October 11th, which is International Day of the Girl Child. So keep your eyes out for an event. Hopefully we'll make it materialize, because it does require a lot of work. We're working on that. And thank you again, Sumita, for doing such a great job moderating. Thank you. That's all I can say. And thank you for all the people who joined in as well. And any last minutes of hope from any of the speakers? What do you see? Just like a line or two, because
Fight on.
I don't see this, as most of you, as Professor Wright and Serena said, I don't think we need to be pessimistic. Sometimes when we do bring out things out in the open, we can address them and maybe
Right.
make the situation a lot better. So let's not give up hope. Let's not get pessimistic. And I do have hope in the younger generation.
Yes,
I agree.
absolutely
wanna
second that.
Yeah, I second that. And I just want to say, I think Dean Jean-Bart's comments were so important to realize that through these dialogues, we have to recognize both the ideal and the I don't know what, the evil, right?
The backlash.
The bad stuff that's been going on, because we're now having these kinds of conversations, and we've been doing it since George Floyd, and it's just been really, I think it's been an incredibly important transition for this country, even while we're sitting here thinking about how we're going to operate under the Stop Woke Act and the Don't Say Gay bill and all of us as Florida academics.
Right.
We are seeing the backlash, but we're also seeing the pushback.
Right, right. Yes. Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating on a Saturday. And hope we will see you again in October. Thank you.
So much, great folks. James Baldwin says, without hope, we're dead, right? So we have to hope.
Yes.
And it's central to our existence. So, but Dr. Wright, Dr. Cruz, it was amazing to be amongst you too. It was great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.